I wanted to thank all our sponsors, which I have to take my glasses off to read, I apologize. Sherry and Herb Ballack, in loving memory of Sherry's father, Abraham Irwin Tahal, who was a quintessential lifelong learner. Debbie and Bruce Buchler, in memory of Debbie's parents, Dorothy and Donald Cashmere Tahal. Barbara and Joel Rich, in memory of Barbara's brother, Stuart Hecht, Shmuel Yosef ben Ruvain Tahal, and Marcia and Jay Goldfisher, in memory of Marcia's father, David Brownstein. Thank you all for joining us. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the microphone over.
Thank you so much.
Whoop. No, I hit the wrong thing. Sorry, stop.
Here we go.
Sorry, I hit the wrong thing. I was
no
trying
worries.
to mute myself.
First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. And thank you to the sponsors. And we'll keep our fingers crossed. For those of you who didn't hear the drama, I'm in California right now, and there's an atmospheric river, or whatever that is, right over our heads. It's very dramatic. It's a Category 5 storm. So I'm hoping the internet and the power will hold out. And if not, I'll try to get on again using my phone. So, or I don't know, maybe we'll have to reschedule, but we'll keep our fingers crossed for now. And because of my sadly outdated bio, I'll just introduce myself. Despite the fact that I live in California with my family, I teach at the University of Toronto in the Department for the Study of Religion and the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies. And what else can I say about myself? I've just finished my 5th book. This is about my 4th book, which is a biography of Sarah Schneer and Beis Yaakov, and Orthodox girls' education. The book that I just finished is about Freud and Jewish languages, so Hebrew and Yiddish and Freud, and the Hebrew and Yiddish translations of Freud. So maybe that's a good enough introduction. Don't want to spend too much time on that. And thank you all for coming out at 8 o'clock to hear about the performance culture of Orthodox Jewish women. And maybe I'll say that one reason I'm so particularly grateful for this particular invitation to talk about this stuff is that I just got I guess it's an award of a semester's leave along with a research grant to research the performance culture of Orthodox Jewish women. And my leave actually started yesterday. So this is my 2nd day of leave. And just to prepare for this talk, I spent my 1st day of actual research working through some of this material and trying to get my ducks in a row. So this is the only thing that makes me actually do work, is when I have a hard deadline, which is what an invitation to speak to a women's Beit Midrash is. So what am I talking about when I talk about the performance culture of Orthodox Jewish women? Why is my slide not progressing? Sorry about that. Here we go. So these are just some of the ways of understanding what I'm talking about. I hope you can see. I think, given that you're a modern Orthodox synagogue, this isn't entirely your demographic. You don't live in a world in which women's voices and faces may not be shown, which is the kind of prime demographic for the women's only performance culture that I'm talking about. And if you look at the bottom right, I actually can't see it on my screen because the share part is covering it. But you see it says for girls, women and girls only. And what's so interesting about the poster on the right is that it's the official selection of the Jerusalem Jewish Film Festival. And clearly the Jerusalem Jewish Film Festival, which is a very prestigious and important film festival, can't actually stop men from walking in the door buying tickets. So the way I understand this is that for women and girls only is a kind of, we did our part. If you come in and look at us putting on a film, that's your sin. Our hands are clean. But basically what you're seeing are 2 examples of a new burgeoning culture of Jewish films created by and for Jewish women and girls. And if you can tell something about these posters, you notice that they don't actually show women's faces. But once you buy your ticket and you go into the theater, you could see a film that's entirely written by women, performed by women. Sometimes the crew is male. We talk about that more. So this is the subject of my research. And even though the film part of it is pretty new, let's say 2 decades old, the other aspect of it, which is productions or performances by and for Jewish girls and women, is actually not new and goes back 100 years. So that's part of the story that I want to tell. And that story begins with, let me just make sure that I didn't miss it. That story begins with Sarah Schneerer, the founder of the transnational Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox girls' school system, Beis Yaakov. And she herself, along with founding schools, was also theater crazy, which was not that unusual in the period in which she lived. The interwar period in Poland was a place of not just theater performed on stages, though there was plenty of that, and Sarah Schneerer loved to go to the theater, but also amateur theater. So theater was understood to be not only something that you do, that you buy a ticket and go to, and not only something you do when you're in school, but something that is done in youth groups, that's done, in other words, a full-scale amateur theater culture, which I would say has almost disappeared in North America today, except in the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox community, which is really quite astonishing because, as we know, this is a community that people think of as enclosed with strict rules, and yet it has this burgeoning culture of theater. Schneerer herself was a playwright, and we have, here we go, we have the first mention of her playwright activities are advertisements. I'm sorry, I don't have the image in front of me to show you, but there's a 1920 advertisement for a play she wrote that's being performed by groups of presumably girls called Yehudis in the Orthodox press, being advertised in the Orthodox press. This story is the slaughter of the general Halifornis by the great Jewish heroine Judith. This is a story that's typically associated with Purim, I'm sorry, with Hanukkah. And Hanukkah is the time that this play was put onto stages. And the Orthodox press seemed okay with this play and advertised it freely. The next notice I found in the archives about what happened to this performance culture is that Sarah Schneerer writes a letter to one of her supporters that unfortunately she's been told by the Belzer Rebbe, she herself is a follower, her family is followers of Belz, that they may not put on plays. He actually forbids them from putting on plays. And she writes to the supporter that she's considering whether it might be permissible, despite what the Belzer Rebbe said, for her to put them on not as kind of what we might call table readings. So instead of having a girl on stage carrying in the script, which I've read, the girl is on stage holding the severed head of the Greek general, or the Syrian general. I'm trying to remember. I guess it's the Greek general. Instead of having anything like that, you just have a bunch of people sitting around reading the lines of her play. So it's very clear that she's really trying to make this work. In 1923, she's figuring out ways to get around the prohibition of her own Hasidic leader. Now, this is 1926, and what you have here is a Polish and Yiddish advertisement in the local press for a historical production done by Beis Yaakov girls. And if you can see at the very bottom, if you read Polish or if you read Yiddish, it says Eingang nur für Frauen, entry for women only. Now, what seems to have happened between 1923 and 1926, what we know happened is that the Beis Yaakov movement was taken over by Agudas Yisrael, the organized political organization of Orthodox Jews. They took over Beis Yaakov itself in 1925, and some kind of compromise seems to have been worked out where plays could be staged with full costumes and advertisements. This is one where it's in a movie theater, and this isn't just what's it called, a school play. It requires admission, you have to buy tickets. This is already a full-fledged, publicly performed amateur theater for girls and women only. It doesn't say exactly what the historical, what actually is going to be performed, but it says it's going to be done by 6-year-old girls. Okay, so what was Beis Yaakov and how did it grow? And here is a chart that the Beis Yaakov movement itself puts out to show its astonishing growth between, you can see 1923 is the year that Sarah Schneer is complaining that the Belzer Rebbe, she already has 7 schools, and he put down his foot about the plays. The plays were already a part of her vision. In 1925 is when the Aguda takes over. And you can see between 1925 and 1926, first thing they do is dramatically slow the expansion of the school system and actually try to professionalize it and create some kind of teacher training program and take it away from Sarah Schneer. And they were not successful in this. Sarah Schneer, they moved the school, her little teacher seminary, which was in her dressmaking studio. They moved it from her, Sarah Schneer was a seamstress who died young, who started this school on her own. They moved it from her studio to an apartment a few blocks away, and they moved the central office to Warsaw, and it didn't help. She just continued operating out of Krakow. She moved into the new seminary building. She remained a major force, and theater became just a more and more important dimension of what the school experience was. So this is a slide that I just put out because in case anyone asks me how I got interested in this topic, I was in this cemetery on the left and I bumped into a group of Beis Yaakov girls. I myself am a former Beis Yaakov girl. And they had come to Krakow to pay tribute to Sarah Schneer in her reconstructed grave. And there's a photo of them. They're there almost every day, almost every night, dancing around her grave. She's venerated. And her insistence on making theater part of the Beis Yaakov experience, I think, is part of the story. So Beis Yaakov, you can see how quickly it grew. I love this old map, much more beautiful than that chart. This is 1931, at which point it's already an international system. And it's in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Lithuania, various other places. And what was it? Mostly it was just a kind of after-school program with no government funding or official status or trained teachers, kind of fly-by-night operations. But as the years went by, it got more and more full-day schools. Like in 1939, there's grade 6 of Slonim. So Slonim was a fairly big Jewish town. It had a full-day school. Ponevich in Lithuania on the bottom right there's a fundraising postcard. It's not a surprise that Ponevich was the site of one of the first Beis Yaakov high schools. The Rosh Yeshiva, Ponevich was the place of a very famous yeshiva, and the head of the yeshiva actually lobbied for Beis Yaakov to open up a high school there because he was Orthodox young women that would be interested in marrying yeshiva graduates. From the start, Beis Yaakov was also about vocational training, and in particular, dressmaking. So dressmaking was typically part of the curriculum. In the 1930s, from the middle of the 1930s on, it actually became much more professionalized with bookkeeping, social work, nursing. Those were degrees that you could get in Beis Yaakov institutions. There was a vocational training school in Lodz that had 300 students. And this, I think, is important, that Beis Yaakov is not only a school movement, it's also a youth movement for graduates of the school, unmarried graduates of the school. And it's also a women's movement. At the Second World Congress of the Agudas Yisrael, Nishei Agudas Yisrael was founded. And once Nishei is founded, Beis Yaakov basically becomes a women's organization that applies to 3-year-old girls as soon as they're ready to enter kindergarten, which is when they're toilet trained, to women. My mother's involved with Nishei Agudas Yisrael. She just turned 100. So my mother was, in the 1940s, my mother was the French representative to the 1949 Nishei Agudas Yisrael conference in Antwerp. And one of the reasons why this is so important for understanding the culture of amateur theater production is that Nishei Agudas Yisrael provides a kind of continuation of the Beis Yaakov experience for adult women. And the amateur theater that I'm talking about is very much transcends the generations. Unlike school plays that typically involve just school-age children, the Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox women's culture that I'm talking about is open to adults too. And there are many theater groups and dance troupes and girls' night out and musical performance opportunities available for adult Orthodox women too. So just to talk about Beis Yaakov theater a little bit more, a couple of things to say about Beis Yaakov theater. It was very clear to everybody that Beis Yaakov theater was an important marketing tool for Beis Yaakov. So Beis Yaakov was so well known for it. It's not just that Beis Yaakov had plays like the Zionist movements and socialist movements and the Tarbut schools. Beis Yaakov was particularly interested in theatrical performance, even more than the socialists, the Zionists, all its competitors. And in a small town, a girl might actually ask her parents to be allowed to go to Beis Yaakov in order for her to participate in this theater culture. And it was actually rather amusing to me to see that when in the Shoah oral history archives, they asked the women what they remember that they learned in Beis Yaakov, and you can see these women in their 80s and 90s can't remember anything, and they're bored by the question, and they say kind of vaguely, yeah, we learned how to daven. And every once in a while, the interviewer says, and do you remember anything else? And they say, oh, the play. And suddenly their eyes light up. So the play was very clearly a highlight and very significant for maintaining the attraction and the appeal of Orthodoxy for a generation of girls and women that were, let's say, vulnerable to the seductions of the modern street and socialism and all these other political movements and youth movements. The play was a really important way to keep them engaged. So a couple more things just about this slide, these are actually 3 slides of Beis Yaakov plays and 1 slide that is not a Beis Yaakov play. And since we're not in a classroom, I guess I won't ask you to guess, but the one on the top left is a Christmas nativity play. So I already told you that these plays are happening over Hanukkah. These are schools that people are generally attending in the afternoon after they spend the morning in a public school where they're probably in a nativity play. And you can see, I put the nativity play right over the Beis Yaakov play on the bottom left to show you how similar they are. In other words, people might be reusing the same costume from the nativity play for this play in the town of Buchach, which is actually where my father was born. And the Beis Yaakov teacher there on the left may actually be my aunt, who was a Beis Yaakov teacher. She died in the Holocaust, and my father's no longer alive. So I don't know. I found this photo in an online archive just a few years ago. It's actually one of the most beautiful Beis Yaakov photos I've ever seen. But this is a photo of Joseph, a very popular play in the repertoire. It's called Joseph and His Brothers. And one of the reasons I think it was popular is that there were so many parts for boys, right? Joseph and his many brothers. And all the little girls wanted to play boys. And as a matter of fact, you have here on the right, another Beis Yaakov play, Kantanistin, which is the story of the young Jewish boys taken to the Tsarist army, also very handy for having lots of male parts. Male parts, I don't think I've ever said that before in that sense. And the girls get to put on little mustaches, as you can see. And if you look up on top, you see another Beis Yaakov. I think this is in the Hungarian town of Kolbashov. Is it Hungarian? I'm not really, this might be another, I don't know what play this is, it didn't say, but you see there the 3 girls in the middle wearing long beards, also very common. And there's actually jokes about this tendency of Beis Yaakov girls to want to put on beards and pants. And sometimes there's a quote from the Pirkei Avos, "B'makom she'ein ish," in a place where there are no men. And the rest of it is try to be a man, but they just have, in the place where, in the place where there are no men, try to be a man works very beautifully as a motto for Beis Yaakov culture. It was an opportunity for the girls to cross-dress. And because this cross-dressing is going on in spaces that are meant to be for girls and women only, within interwar Polish culture, in which there are lots of young people that are crazy for theater, you also start getting lots of stories about boys trying to sneak into these plays dressed as girls in order to see the girls dressed as boys on stage. Apparently, this was not an infrequent occurrence in interwar Poland. So along with the plays going on stage are also the plays that are part of the larger culture. So why was Beis Yaakov theater so significant, along with this, the idea that it was marketing? One reason is that unlike, and there's no real counterpart to this within boys' culture. So boys did not have these professional theaters, Orthodox boys I'm talking about, where they spent a lot of time in their yeshivas, rehearsing elaborate sets, costumes. The Rebbes weren't writing scripts. There's a little material around Purim, but basically not that much going on around Hanukkah, which was the big season for amateur theater production in interwar Poland. Until the 1930s, that's another story, clearly an imitation of girls' culture. But one of the reasons why girls were doing this is that, unlike the boys, they didn't have the commandment to study Torah all day. It wasn't even clear that they were allowed to study Torah. So finding things they could do with their time that weren't studying Torah, that kept the distinction of Torah study, especially Talmud study, for boys, was a big part of how this theater culture developed. And there's a literary critic who calls this, in a different context, the benefits of marginality. Sometimes it's good to have the rabbis think that you're unimportant, and to not try to police what you're doing every minute. And in that vacuum, this very elaborate theater performance culture was allowed to bloom. Let me just check the time. So one of the most interesting little stories I found in the Yiddish press into our period, I started by showing you that the Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox world is actively making films for women and girls. There's a story in the press about the Aguda taking on filmmaking of its own. So the Aguda macht eigene Filmen. The Aguda is making its own film, and it says they're preparing, they're making movie stars out of the Beis Yaakov girls. It's a very interesting and story, which I spent a lot of time trying to figure out whether it was a spoof or an actual story. But I'll just tell you really quickly what the story is. A group of Aguda functionaries go into a Beis Yaakov, actually the biggest Beis Yaakov in Warsaw, on Twarda Street. And they go into, they see the girls are studying Torah, beautiful. And then one of them has this idea, and he says to the girls, who's the most famous woman in the world? The correct answer being Sarah Schneer. And they say Marlene Dietrich. And the Aguda functionary, administrator, is really upset. And he says, he looks at the teacher, and the girl looks at him being upset. And she says, she figures she made a mistake, and she says, no, it's Hanka Andragovna, who's a local film star, a Polish film star. In other words, she thinks he's offended because she's mentioned an American film star, and to be more Polish and nationalist, she says a Polish film star. And he's like, no, this is terrible. And he calls an emergency meeting of all the Aguda activists. And he says, what are we going to do? We have to solve this problem. And they talk about it, and they decide they're sending someone to America to raise money to make a Beis Yaakov film. And then this person comes back from America. All of this is exactly how Beis Yaakov functioned. They sent someone to America to get a script from Sarah Schneer, also highly plausible. She's the one who was the script writer. And they start shooting, and in locations in Poland and Palestine. And the thing that made me realize it was probably a spoof is that it says that Sarah Schneer got on a boat to scout locations in Palestine. And it's well known that Sarah Schneer never made it to Palestine. It was her greatest sorrow. So this is a kind of strange counter-historical artifact in the Yiddish press that almost predicts where Beis Yaakov will go. And even though it never happened, it tells you something about the Aguda mentality, which is whatever the boys, you have to be super strict with. But the girls, if there's something that really appeals to them, figure out, if you possibly can, and this is what differentiates the Aguda from various more to the right ultra-Orthodox rabbinic authorities, figure out how to make a kosher alternative. Figure out how to do something that makes the girls happy, that takes their time, that cements their attraction to Orthodoxy, and allow them to do it and even support them doing it. So let me just say, so Beis Yaakov, as you know, continues to flourish today. It very quickly rebuilt itself after the Holocaust. This is, on the bottom right, is an image of Beis Yaakov in a DP camp. On the bottom left is an image of Beis Yaakov of Shanghai, which was one of the refugee community Beis Yaakovs, another DP camp, and then Palestine. And Beis Yaakov is now completely international. One of the things I've been doing with my research is trying to count every Beis Yaakov in the world. We're over 800 at this point. So the one on the top right is Beis Yaakov Borough Park, which I went to. And on left of that is Montreal, Beis Yaakov of Denver, on camp on the right, Toronto on the left, and Detroit in the middle. Did performance culture continue in these years after the Holocaust? Yes, it did. And actually the longest running Beis Yaakov that we know of, the one that's pretty much been operating only with the briefest, with the brief interruption after the Holocaust, but then began again in 1945 with 17 students, is Beis Yaakov of Antwerp in Belgium. And here's a photo from the early 1950s of Beis Yaakov girls putting on some kind of, I don't know, to me it looks like Oklahoma. We don't actually know what the play is, but you can see that they're wearing pants, and that's actually not done in all Beis Yaakov plays anymore. And this is more like what a Beis Yaakov play looks like in 2005, Beis Yaakov in Borough Park, Beis Yaakov High School. The urge of girls to wear pants, basically they've stopped allowing that in many, many Beis Yaakovs. They have in Beis Yaakov of Toronto, they have these skirts that are kind of shirred at the bottom, so they look a little bit like pants. But they also sometimes have, men behind male characters behind tables. It's very interesting to see that the male and female characters do not touch, in other words, keep the laws of Jewish modesty. These are not romances for the most part. These are just, and this is a play that's being put on within a Hasidic community. So the Beis Yaakov play, Beis Yaakov is now mostly yeshivish, but the Hasidic world participates in this aspect of its culture with a lot more constraints and a lot more rabbinic authority and a lot more contention. And what you have here is just the most recent point of contention, but they're more or less continuous, which is that you have a private, this is Hackney Empire, which is a huge theater. You can see on the bottom left in London. And these are Hasidic singers who sing in Yiddish, Hebrew, and English. And they put on concerts for girls and ladies and girls. That's the word for women in the ultra-Orthodox community, ladies. And you need a code in order to book a ticket. They're trying all they can to make this a kosher event. And nevertheless, a Hasidic organization called Va'ad Leman Taharat HaMachaneh, which is the committee for the defense of the purity of the community, has come out for reasons it doesn't state, and this is an almost sold out show, and said that they are forbidding girls and women from attending this. So they're trying to stop this kind of public performance, though, as I said, they don't exactly say why. what's going to happen, I think this particular play is in 11 days. So stay tuned and see who wins. Is this culture of girls and women entertaining each other, performing for each other, being, superstars and celebrities for each other, as these two women certainly are? This is a huge hall that they've nearly sold out. Are those people going to win? This has already played itself out in the male world with Lipa Schmelzer selling out Madison Square Garden, and then the rabbis at the last minute coming in and pulling the plug, or whether the rabbis will have any control over this. And as I've said, it's 2023. Exactly 100 years ago, in 1923, Sarah Schneer was dealing with the same issue. The Belzer Rebbe telling her, sorry, you're not putting on a play. And she found the way to do it. And my suspicion is that these women will find the way to do it too. So I just really need to see your faces. Boy, thank you, those of you who are showing your faces. It makes a difference.
I just wanted, you wanted a time check. You wanted a time check, so it's 8:40.
So I could make a few more final statements, and just to try to wrap it up on what I think this means. So first of all, I just want to point out that this is a quite astonishing phenomenon. As I said, amateur theater, which, in the 19th century, the early 20th century, these performances that people put on for each other, dances, that's pretty much dead in our culture. And I wonder if that might be true in the modern Orthodox world too. So to recognize that within the ultra-Orthodox world, which people think is so restricted and full of rules, to discover a thriving culture of amateur performance on every level. In other words, open mic nights where women comics, comedians can get up. I think that itself is just insufficiently recognized and known. So part of my mission is to get the word out. It's also this whole theater culture is denigrated by the men around it when they're not trying to control it. So they make fun of it, right? Like I hear, the men in my family, oh, production. That's the word for these like song and dance extravaganzas with elaborate sets, etc. Production. The boys think the boys and the men are actually taught to dismiss it as women's ridiculousness. But I think they're actually jealous, and it's not just into our period that I see evidence for that, and there's lots of evidence for that, but also in our own time. And then the question of what is this theater and how do we think about it? And I think it's tempting to see theater as a place of freedom. And I'll just remind people that theater is both about a certain kind of freedom to be someone other than who you are fated to be, right? So I talked about the girls with the beards, the girls who are boys. So a moment to not be a girl, but to also be a boy, or even to be a rabbi, or even to behead the general. So these are strong and powerful, let's call them, rebellious impulses that could be expressed on the stage through the medium of theater. But the theater is also a place of rules, right? There's a script you're supposed to follow. There's a director. So theater really falls within that freedom and let's call it constraint. That is part of the culture of Orthodox girls and women. I think because of the fact that the Orthodox world needs its girls and women in order to continue its line, but hasn't sufficiently figured out what to do with girls and women, with the delay of marriage, etc. Which gets me to another point, which is that this is a temporal phenomenon. For most girls and women, this is something they will do in a very concentrated fashion in their teenage years. And then they may be an occasional performer, or maybe if they're really interested, they'll try to make a living doing it. I have met Orthodox women that are making a living as playwrights, as filmmakers. So it is possible. but most of them will then just do it in an amateur fashion. They'll be the audience members, they'll be the consumers for this. And it's important to have an audience, and to be trained as a performer is one way to build up an audience. But there is something about the temporal force of this that I interviewed some women about their own experiences within this performance culture, including the granddaughter of a very famous Hasidic Rebbe his name I will not mention, who said, this was something I could do as a teenager, but now I can't do it anymore. So I knew even as a teenager that this was my opportunity. So we know that there are other, I guess, fundamentalist religions, not to call Orthodoxy fundamentalist, but just very strict religious cultures that allow young people, right? The Amish are famous for this. I forget what it's called, right? This year that you get to be wild. So it turns out that ultra-Orthodoxy also needs something like a temporally bounded, less restricted period in which to at least break certain rules. And I think what that means is that through this both attempt through, let's say, pious scripts and heartfelt music to make Orthodoxy appeal to young girls and women who are, at that moment when they're in danger of going elsewhere, right? We know that the rate of people leaving the Orthodox world is high. To keep them in by both giving them lessons about what it means to be Orthodox through these scripts, and also by giving them a little bit of freedom to express themselves even within this highly constrained society. So that's my basic argument, and I'm very eager to hear your thoughts and any questions you might have.